Sophie, a cynical woman living in a grey, drizzly Seattle, is cursed with a 3-sentence death sentence. Anyone who speaks 3 full sentences to her, or initiates 3 distinct exchanges of dialogue, is marked for a gruesome, architecturally impossible correction by reality. Having grown weary of the messy cleanup, Sophie moves through life with the cold detachment of a long-term convict. When an ambitious work rival, Melissa, tries to sabotage her career by forcing her into conversation, Sophie must navigate the office without triggering the curse, all while a mysterious entity, the Curator, watches, demanding she maintain her kill rate to avoid becoming the next victim herself. It is a story of gallows humor, visceral body horror, and the crushing weight of trying not to be a mass murderer in a city that refuses to stop talking. Welcome to Horcom After Dark. Turn down the lights, get comfortable, and prepare for stories that linger long after the screen goes dark. Let's begin. The city of Seattle was a perpetual, weeping gray, a perfect backdrop for a woman who was technically a walking industrial accident. Sophie stood under the rusted awning of a bus stop, her noise-cancelling headphones serving less as a music device and more as a "do not approach" sign. She wasn't on the bus, she was waiting for the 402, staring at the rain-slicked pavement as if searching for a way to dissolve into the concrete. A man in a crisp, overly starched raincoat sat down on the bench, clutching a briefcase like it contained the secrets of the universe. He checked his watch, looked at the stalled traffic and sighed. Traffic's a nightmare today, isn't it? I've been sitting here for 10 minutes, and we haven't moved an inch. It really makes you wonder why we even bother with the commute. Sophie didn't look at him. That was one. Seriously, I think we're going to be here for another hour, at least. My boss is going to have my head if I'm late again today. I'm Julian, by the way, and I'm having a truly terrible Tuesday. Sophie's eye twitched. That was 2. She stood up, her heart hammering a frantic, suicidal rhythm against her ribs. She took 3 steps away, not looking back. You have no idea what you're doing, so just keep your mouth shut and leave me alone. Julian blinked, offended. He stood up, towering over her, and opened his mouth to deliver his final, indignant retort. You know, you really shouldn't be so rude to strangers when they're just trying to make polite conversation. You clearly have some kind of psychological issue that needs addressing, and I'm honestly just trying to help you out here. 3. The world didn't just go dark, it stuttered. Julian's jaw snapped shut, his teeth shattering against one another with the sound of gravel in a blender. His body didn't fall, it underwent a rapid, recursive collapse. His spine folded backward, his knees popping out of their sockets to tuck behind his ears, while his skin pulled tight, darkening into the texture of polished leather. In a wet, grinding chorus of snapping cartilage and pressurized air, Julian was forced inward. His torso flattened, his limbs retracted into his cavity, and his internal organs were liquefied into a slurry that soaked his own suit. He was compressed into a perfect, 40-centimeter cube of bone, gore, and expensive polyester. He hit the bench with a heavy, wet thump that sounded like a bag of meat being dropped from a height. The woman standing 3 feet away stared at the cube, her eyes bulging until they seemed ready to pop from their sockets. She let out a high-pitched, warbling shriek that sounded like a bird being strangled. She scrambled backward, tripped over her own umbrella, and began to run, but her legs were moving faster than her brain could coordinate. She performed a frantic, uncoordinated crab run across the sidewalk, arms flailing, screaming, "Oh God," he became a box, a meat box. She slammed into a garbage can, performed a somersault over it, and kept sprinting into the rain, periodically glancing back and shrieking, "The box is looking at me." Sophie picked up her bag, carefully stepping over the cube of Julian. "You're telling me," she sighed, her tone weary, not shocked. She was already 7 minutes late for her shift at the firm, and she really didn't want to explain why another pedestrian had been edited on her way to work. She pushed through the glass doors of the office, where her rival, Melissa, was already standing by the reception desk, her eyes narrowing as she took in Sophie's disheveled state. "You look like you've been dragging something through the mud, Sophie," Melissa sneered, checking her own flawless nails. "The board is waiting in the conference room, and if you're not there in 2 minutes, I'm taking your lead on the regional account. Sophie didn't answer. She couldn't afford a single sentence with Melissa, not today. She walked straight past her, leaving Melissa to fume in the lobby, unaware that she had just narrowly avoided becoming the firm's newest piece of office furniture. The office was a cathedral of hushed typing and frantic keyboard tapping. For Sophie, it was a sanctuary of enforced silence. Ever since the incident, during her first week, where a chatty junior analyst had been unceremoniously turned into a geometric puddle of office supplies, the firm had adopted a strict, almost religious adherence to digital communication. Sophie sat in her glass-walled cubicle, watching the cursor on her screen blink. Her inbox was a waterfall of passive-aggressive emails. From Melissa, Regional Lead. Subject, Your Tardiness. Body, the board meeting started 10 minutes ago. Your absence is a pathetic display of unprofessionalism that I intend to highlight in your performance review. Do not bother showing your face in the conference room. Sophie didn't reply. She couldn't. If she typed a response that triggered a conversation, she risked the count. She simply archived the email, a small, grim smile touching her lips. Melissa was pushing for the third sentence, unaware that she was orchestrating her own spectacular end. Every colleague in the building knew the rules, mostly because they were terrified of becoming a stain on the carpet. They sent requests via Slack, emails, and internal memos. Sophie stood up to grab a coffee, moving through the office like a ghost. The air hummed with the sound of collective, muffled breathing. As she passed the break room, she saw Melissa standing by the coffee machine, her posture radiating predatory irritation. Melissa turned, her eyes locking onto Sophie's with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. Melissa marched over, her heels clicking against the hardwood like a countdown. She stopped directly in front of Sophie, her face twisted into a sneer. She had clearly decided that the email policy was beneath her. I am sick and tired of your silent, brooding act that you think makes you look mysterious, Melissa spat, her voice ringing out in the quiet break room, causing several colleagues to flinch and retreat behind their monitors. That was sentence 1. Sophie didn't stop walking, but she felt the air around Melissa begin to vibrate with a low-frequency hum, the telltale sound of the universe preparing to edit. Melissa followed her, her voice rising in volume, drawing more attention. Do you honestly think that ignoring everyone around you is going to help you keep your job, when I'm clearly the better candidate for the promotion? That was sentence 2. Sophie stopped at her desk and turned, her expression carefully blank. She knew she shouldn't react, but the temptation to watch Melissa's hubris lead to her own undoing was almost intoxicating. Melissa stepped closer, her eyes flashing. You are a coward who hides behind a screen, because you have absolutely nothing of value to say to anyone in this building. 3. The office didn't just go quiet, it seemed to vanish. A hush fell over the room so heavy that Sophie could hear the gears of the building's air conditioning grinding to a halt. Melissa stopped mid-gasp. Her jaw went slack, not in shock, but because her physical form was beginning to betray the laws of biology. Her right foot suddenly curled upward with a sickening crack, her toes vanishing into her own ankle. Melissa let out a gurgled scream, but before she could make a sound, her entire foot was sucked into her calf like a limb being pulled into a dark, pressurized pipe. My feet, she shrieked, her voice distorted and shrill. What is happening to my feet? Her colleagues stood frozen, their mouths agape, their phones held up to record the horror as Melissa's legs began to invert, folding into her own torso as if she were a long, pale snake being swallowed by its own tail. It was a slow, agonizingly deliberate motion. She wasn't just collapsing, she was physically consuming her own lower half, the skin stretching and snapping as her feet disappeared into her pelvis, then her knees, then her thighs. She clutched at the edge of Sophie's desk, her fingers leaving streaks of blood on the polished wood. She looked at Sophie, her eyes pleading for a mercy that didn't exist in the algorithm. Then, with one final, wet gulp of reality, Melissa's torso folded into her own neck, her jaw snapping shut as the last of her hair vanished into the dark, churning void of her own anatomy. In less than 10 seconds, Melissa was gone. All that remained was a single, perfectly polished shoe sitting on the carpet, and a faint, lingering scent of ozone. The office remained silent. A junior analyst, still clutching his phone, slowly reached out and typed a message into the group Slack. Is that an emailable offense? The silence that followed Melissa's disappearance was punctured only by the frantic, rhythmic click-clack of keyboards. It was a bizarre, Pavlovian response. Whenever reality tore itself open and someone ceased to exist, the staff simply typed harder. Sophie stood alone in the break room, staring at the empty space where her rival had just folded into oblivion. She didn't feel triumph, just the bone-deep exhaustion of a long-term employee who had to deal with yet another HR incident. She walked back to her cubicle, stepping carefully around the lone, abandoned high heel. As she sat down, a notification pinged on her monitor. It wasn't an email from a peer. It was a direct, internal memo from the CEO, a man she had never actually met, who communicated solely through a pre-recorded, text-to-speech avatar. Memo, regarding the latest incident in the break room. Body, performance remains the firm's primary metric. Sophie, your efficiency ratings have increased by 14% since the regional account was vacated. Your ability to streamline workflow remains unparalleled, even with the localized spatial anomalies that tend to follow you. As long as you continue to exceed quarterly targets, the company will overlook the occasional restructuring of personnel. It was the ultimate, cold-blooded pragmatism. Sophie was the firm's golden goose, a human algorithm of output who never took breaks, never complained, and effectively eliminated any overhead costs associated with inter-office conflict. She was, in the eyes of the board, the most valuable asset they had ever acquired. Her phone buzzed. A message from Arthur, a senior data analyst, who lived on the third floor, and had been eyeing her position for months. Arthur, I saw what happened to Melissa. Do you think we could discuss your methodology for the Q3 report over lunch? I really feel like we have a lot to talk about, and I'm prepared to spend as much time as it takes to get on the same page. Sophie stared at the message, her pulse steady. Arthur was clever, but he was also persistent. He was trying to bait her into a conversation, using the Q3 report as a lure to bypass the office's digital-only mandate. She leaned back, her chair creaking in the unnaturally quiet room. She looked out toward the third-floor stairwell, where Arthur was currently pacing. He held his phone up, watching her through the glass partitions, waiting for a response that would count as his first strike. She didn't type back. Instead, she opened the Q3 report, a massive, complex model that would take a normal team weeks to finish, and began to work. Her fingers flew across the keys, her mind slipping into the cold, detached focus that kept the curator at bay. If she remained the most efficient machine in the building would protect her. She typed a single, cold line to Arthur. Send your queries via the formal ticketing portal. Arthur stopped pacing. He stared at her through the glass, his jaw tight. He knew he had lost his opening. He turned to walk back to his desk, but as he moved, a shadow detached itself from the wall behind him, a flickering, two-dimensional silhouette that moved with a predatory, calculated grace. The curator was watching. Sophie could feel it in the sudden, sharp drop in room temperature. The curator didn't care about the board's productivity metrics. It wanted the show to continue. And if Sophie was too efficient to be bothered, the curator would have to find more creative ways to introduce dialogue. Sophie sighed, opening a new spreadsheet. She had a report to finish, a ghost to ignore, and a curse to manage. It was just another day at the firm. The ultimate corporate nightmare didn't begin with a fire or an earthquake. It began with the little green dot on Sophie's Slack icon turning a hollow, desolate grey. Connecting. Across the floor, the rhythmic clatter of keyboards abruptly halted. The silence that followed wasn't the usual, terrified quiet of the firm, it was a confused, panicked void. The Wi-Fi was down. The internal servers had crashed. In a company where verbal communication was a literal death sentence, a network outage was the equivalent of disabling the oxygen scrubbers on a submarine. Sophie immediately looked toward the ceiling corners, where the shadows seemed to be pooling with an unnatural, ink-like density. The curator. The entity was bored of her email strategy, and had decided to force the issue. It was cutting the digital umbilical cord. A collective murmur began to rise from the cubicles. It was a terrifying sound, the sound of people realizing they might have to actually use their vocal cords. "Is the router resetting?" someone whispered from the back, their voice trembling with genuine terror. Before Sophie could grab a notepad to write a warning, a shadow fell over her desk. Arthur stood in the entrance of her cubicle. He looked flushed, a bead of sweat tracing the line of his jaw, but his eyes gleamed with a predatory, opportunistic light. He saw the server crash not as a threat, but as a loophole. "The servers are down, so you can't hide behind your screen anymore, Sophie," Arthur said, crossing his arms and leaning against the glass partition. Sophie held up her hands, her eyes wide. She grabbed a red Sharpie and frantically began to write on a sticky note, "Go away. Do not speak." Arthur scoffed, ignoring the note entirely. "I need the source data for the Q3 model right now, or I'm going straight to the board to tell them you're maliciously withholding assets." That was two. Sophie stood up, slapping the sticky note onto his chest. She pointed to it, her face a mask of desperate, silent pleading. She mimed zipping her lips, then drew a slashing motion across her throat. Arthur ripped the sticky note off his shirt, his face turning a blotchy red. He was too consumed by the prospect of a promotion to read the room, or the literal warning signs. He leaned in, invading her space, his breath smelling faintly of stale coffee and mints. "Stop waving your hands around like a lunatic, and just tell me the password." 3. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, emitting a high-pitched, harmonic whine. Arthur's mouth remained open, but the angry air rushing from his lungs was suddenly choked off. His eyes darted around in sudden, paralyzed panic. The transformation began at his extremities. His skin rapidly bleached, losing all its pink and olive tones until it matched the stark, blinding white of standard A4 printer paper. Arthur tried to gasp, but his voice sounded like tearing cardboard. He didn't collapse, he delaminated. With a rapid, sickening shhhk sound, Arthur's entire body began to slice itself into micro-thin, two-dimensional cross-sections. Starting from the front of his nose and moving backward, his anatomy peeled away in perfectly uniform sheets. Slices of Arthur, cross-sections of his brain, his lungs, his coffee-stained digestive tract, and his tailored suit, flew through the air like pages caught in a heavy wind. He couldn't scream, because his vocal cords had already been filed away. He just stared at Sophie with half a face, as the universe rapidly processed him into physical data. The sheets of Arthur fluttered downward, guided by some invisible, bureaucratic gravity, and landed in a perfectly aligned, heavy stack directly inside Sophie's iron tray. The final sheet, a cross-section of the back of his skull and a sliver of suit jacket, settled gently on top. A beat of profound, horrifying silence passed. Then, the little green dot on Sophie's monitor popped back to life. A cheerful ding echoed from her speakers as Slack reconnected. The Wi-Fi was back. A few cubicles down, the IT manager popped his head up over his partition. "False alarm, everyone. Just a localized packet drop. We're back online." Sophie let out a long, shaky exhale. She looked at the bloody, intricate anatomical diagrams stacked in her inbox. They were perfectly aligned, not a single drop of biological matter spilling onto her desk. The curator appreciated a clean aesthetic. She sat back down, pulled her keyboard toward her, and opened a new email to the janitorial staff. From Sophie. To Facilities Management. Subject, routine cleanup. Body, please bring the industrial shredder to my cubicle. Arthur has been archived. The calendar notification popped up on Sophie's screen at precisely 4:45 p.m. Meeting, quarterly review. Location, conference room C. Organizer, the curator. Sophie's stomach dropped. The firm didn't have a curator on payroll, and conference room C had been sealed off since a horrific incident in 2022 involving a rogue intern and a ceiling fan. She stood up, her joints popping in the quiet office. No one looked at her. Her colleagues were too busy pretending they hadn't just watched Arthur become the office's most morbid stationery. She walked down the hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing with an anxious, erratic rhythm the closer she got to the frosted glass door of room C. She pushed the door open. The room was freezing, smelling heavily of ozone, stale rain, and the faint, coppery tang of old blood. Sitting at the head of the long mahogany table was a figure. It was wearing a bespoke, charcoal grey suit, but that was where its adherence to standard reality ended. Above the collar, there was no head, just a swirling, three-dimensional void of static, like a television tuned to a dead channel, contained within the rough silhouette of a human skull. "Take a seat, Sophie," the static hissed. The voice didn't come from the void. It vibrated directly against Sophie's eardrums, echoing with the stolen cadence of every person she had ever watched die. Sophie sat down at the opposite end of the table, clutching her notepad. She didn't speak. She knew the rule. "Oh, relax," the curator said, gesturing with a hand that seemed to glitch in and out of focus. "You can talk to me. I'm management." The three-sentence threshold only applies to the consumer base. Sophie cleared her throat. It felt like swallowing glass. She hadn't spoken aloud in weeks. "What do you want?" I hit the quota. "Arthur is in my inbox. Melissa is digesting herself. I'm doing my job." The curator folded its hands. A manila folder materialized on the table. It wasn't made of paper. It looked uncomfortably fleshy, complete with a birthmark on the upper left corner. The curator flipped it open. "Let's talk about your deliverables, Sophie," the entity said, sounding exactly like a disappointed middle manager. "Your volume is excellent. The efficiency? Unparalleled. But the aesthetics, we need to have a conversation about your creative direction." Sophie blinked. "My creative direction? They are dying. Isn't that enough?" "It's not just about the death, Sophie. It's about the narrative," the curator sighed, the static swirling into a deep, bruised purple. "Take Arthur, for example. Sliced into A4 paper. A bit on the nose, don't you think? It's derivative. And Julian, turning a man into a cube of meat is funny once, maybe twice. But the audience is experiencing fatigue. We're seeing a 12% drop in cosmic engagement. I am trying to avoid killing people." Sophie snapped, slamming her hands on the table. "I don't choose how they go. The universe just corrects them. The universe is an algorithm, and you are the content creator," the curator corrected sharply. "It responds to your subconscious. You view your coworkers as soulless drones, so they die like office supplies. It's lazy writing, Sophie. And frankly, the board of observers is getting bored. There's no emotional stakes." The temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees. A layer of frost began to form on the polished mahogany table. "So, I'm putting you on a performance improvement plan," the curator announced, closing the fleshy folder. "We need higher stakes. We need tragedy. We need you to leave this sterile little office, go out into the city, and form a genuine emotional connection with someone before they trigger the count." Sophie felt the blood drain from her face. "You want me to intentionally date someone, just to watch them die?" "I want romance, Sophie. I want a broken heart," the curator said, its static face leaning closer, the void swirling with cruel amusement. "If you don't raise the emotional resonance of your kills by the end of the fiscal week, you'll be in breach of contract. And you know what happens during corporate downsizing." The curator didn't wait for her to answer. The entity simply collapsed in on itself, folding into a single, blinding point of light before vanishing entirely, leaving behind nothing but the smell of ozone and the fleshy folder on the table. Sophie sat alone in the freezing conference room. She pulled out her phone, her hands trembling violently. She didn't open her work email. She opened the App Store. She had 3 days to find a man, make him care about her, and let him talk himself to death. With a hollow, self-loathing laugh, Sophie began to download Tinder. The bureaucracy of murder was evolving, and she was about to take her talents to the dating pool. Curating a dating profile, when you are an active biohazard requires a very specific brand of sociopathy. Sitting in the dim, Edison bulb glow of an overpriced Seattle speakeasy, Sophie nursed a gin and tonic and reviewed her Tinder bio, not a big talker. Prefer comfortable silence. Looking for someone who doesn't need to fill the void with words. Seriously, do not talk to me. To her horror, men in the Pacific Northwest found this incredibly alluring. They thought she was a mysterious introvert, rather than a localized weapon of mass destruction. She had swiped right on a man named Silas mostly, because his profile picture featured him standing on a mountain, looking entirely too peaceful. He looked like the kind of guy who could handle a tragic, avant-garde demise. The bell above the bar chimed, and Silas walked in. He looked exactly like his photos, tall, wearing a faded flannel shirt, with kind, crinkling eyes that immediately made Sophie feel a sickening wave of guilt. He spotted her, smiled warmly, and walked over. Sophie immediately braced herself, her hand gripping the edge of the bar. Here it comes, she thought. Sentence 1. Say hi, how are you, and let's get this execution underway. Silas didn't speak. Instead, he sat down next to her, pulled out his phone, typed something rapidly with his thumbs, and slid the screen across the polished wood. Hi, Sophie. I'm Silas. I should probably tell you right off the bat. I'm profoundly deaf. I hope you don't mind texting, or using the Notes app for tonight. Sophie stared at the screen. A massive, breathless wave of relief washed over her. A loophole. The curse specifically stated spoken sentences, or verbal exchanges. If he couldn't speak, he couldn't trigger the count. He was safe. For the first time in years, she was sitting across from a human being and didn't have to visualize them turning into a geometry puzzle. She pulled her own phone out and typed back. I don't mind at all. In fact, I prefer it. Drinks are on me. Silas beamed, a genuine, unguarded smile that made Sophie's chest ache in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with the curator's quota. For the next hour, they didn't utter a single sound. They passed the phone back and forth like a sacred artifact. They talked about his job as an architect, her vague and highly stressful corporate gig, and the oppressive Seattle rain. Silas was funny. He was observant. He typed out a hilarious, scathing review of the bartender's man bun that made Sophie actually, audibly snort her gin. She was having fun. It was a terrifying sensation. Then, Silas put the phone down. He looked at her, his expression softening. He reached out and gently touched her wrist to get her attention. With slow, deliberate movements, he raised his hands and signed something. He pointed to her, brought his hand down to his chest, and then made a fluid, sweeping motion outward. Sophie froze. The air in the speakeasy suddenly plummeted by 10 degrees. The condensation on her gin glass crystallized into frost. The ambient chatter of the bar faded into a dull, muffled hum, replaced by the faint, terrifying sound of radio static. She grabbed the phone and frantically typed, "What did you just say?" Silas took the phone, looking slightly confused by her sudden panic, and typed back, "I said, I am really glad I met you." That was one. Sophie's stomach violently dropped into her shoes. The curse wasn't limited to acoustics. It was a semantic predator. It didn't care if the sentence was spoken from the larynx, written on a screen, or woven into the air with hands. It registered the intent of communication. The exchange of an idea. Before Sophie could stop him, Silas's hands were moving again. He smiled, gesturing toward the empty glasses between them. "Do you want to get out of here and grab some food?" The frost on the bar spread, reaching the edge of Silas's coaster. That was two. Sophie shot out of her bar stool, knocking it backward. It hit the floor with a loud clatter, drawing the stares of half the patrons. Silas looked up, his hands freezing mid-air, concern washing over his face. She couldn't text him. If she texted him an explanation, he would reply. He would sign, or he would type, and he would complete the third exchange. She had to shut down the communication entirely. She had to break his heart before the universe broke his molecular structure. Sophie looked at the kind, handsome man, who had just given her the best hour she'd had in a decade. She channeled every ounce of corporate, sociopathic coldness she had learned at the firm, sneered at him with visceral disgust, and threw a $50 bill at his chest. She didn't type a goodbye. She just turned on her heel and sprinted out the door, leaving Silas sitting alone in the freezing booth, one sentence away from becoming modern art. As she burst out into the pouring Seattle rain, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from an unknown number. Excellent character development, Sophie. 5 stars. But you can't run forever. The walk back to her apartment was a miserable blur of freezing Seattle rain and crushing guilt. Sophie unlocked her door, peeling off her soaked coat, when her television turned itself on. It wasn't broadcasting the local news. The screen displayed a crisp, corporate dashboard, complete with pie charts and line graphs, all rendered in a sickly, pulsating neon green. Observer engagement metrics, Q3 update. Kill rate, optimal, trend, stable, consistent output. Good job. Aesthetic quality, poor, trend, declining, meat cubes are passé. Emotional resonance, critical, trend, spiking, Silas arc initiated. Keep it up. Sophie grabbed the remote and hurled it at the screen, cracking the LCD panel, but the image simply distorted and continued to glow through the spiderweb fractures. The curator was treating her misery like a prime-time soap opera. She slumped onto her couch, burying her face in her hands. She had done the right thing. She had run away. Silas was confused, probably angry, but most importantly, he was alive. He still had his bones. He wasn't a piece of office furniture. A knock at the door made her blood run cold. It wasn't a frantic, aggressive knock. It was polite. 2 taps, a pause, and a 3rd tap. Sophie crept to the peephole. Standing in the poorly lit hallway, dripping wet from the rain, was Silas. He was holding the scarf she had accidentally left draped over the bar stool. He looked deeply concerned, not angry. No, Sophie thought, her breath catching in her throat. No, no, no. You sweet, stubborn idiot. She didn't open the door. She backed away, pressing her hands over her eyes. If she didn't see his hands, the communication couldn't be completed. The intent wouldn't land. But the curator didn't tolerate plot holes. The heavy oak door of her apartment didn't just swing open, it dissolved into a flurry of digital ash, blowing past Silas, and leaving him standing in the threshold. He jumped back, startled, looking at the empty doorframe in absolute bewilderment. Then, he looked up and saw Sophie cowering in the living room. He stepped inside. The air pressure in the room dropped so fast Sophie's ears popped. She squeezed her eyes shut. Don't look at him, she chanted to herself. Don't look, don't look, don't look. Ping. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. It wasn't a text. The curator had hijacked her device, forcing it to project a blindingly bright, holographic interface directly onto her closed eyelids. She couldn't look away, the image was burning directly into her retinas. It was a live feed of Silas standing 3 feet in front of her. Through the projection, she saw him raise his hands. His expression was a heartbreaking mixture of relief and deep empathy. He thought her front door had been kicked in. He thought she was in danger. His hands moved with fluid, desperate grace. I was so worried. I just wanted to make sure you were okay. 3. The holographic projection clicked off. Sophie opened her eyes, gasping for air. Silas froze. The concern on his face hardened, not into fear, but into absolute, rigid immobility. The curator had demanded romance and tragedy, and it was rewriting the laws of physics to deliver an agonizingly poetic finale. The temperature in the room skyrocketed. The rain dripping from Silas's flannel shirt began to hiss, instantly turning into steam. A deep, agonizingly bright orange light began to radiate from beneath his skin, as if he had swallowed a localized sun. He didn't scream, because his lungs were already crystallizing. His flesh became translucent, his blood turning into veins of molten, glowing glass. Sophie watched in paralyzed horror as Silas's entire biological structure, his muscles, his organs, the kind eyes that had crinkled when he laughed, was superheated and fused into flawless, anatomical stained glass. He was a living sculpture of pure, agonizing heat, illuminating the dark apartment with a beautiful, horrific, amber glow. Then, the cold, damp draft from the open doorway swept over him. The thermal shock was instantaneous. Crack. It sounded like a glacier splitting in half. Silas's crystalline body fractured along a million microscopic stress lines. For one suspended second, he remained standing, a mosaic of broken, glowing glass. Then, he shattered. He exploded outward in a wave of razor-sharp, bloody silica. Sophie threw her arms up, but the shrapnel tore through her living room, embedding glowing shards of Silas into the drywall, the couch, and her own skin. A heavy, ringing silence fell over the apartment, broken only by the soft tick-tick-tick of glass raining down onto the hardwood floor. Sophie fell to her knees, blood trickling from a shallow cut on her cheek. She stared at the pile of glowing, cooling glass fragments that used to be the first man she had liked in half a decade. Amidst the rubble, perfectly preserved in a chunk of solid, transparent crystal, was her scarf. Her phone chimed. A standard, cheerful notification sound that echoed through the graveyard of her living room. New message from the Curator. Body, bravo, Sophie. Tears. Drama. The board is giving this a standing ovation. Your quarterly quota has been reset. Take the weekend off. You've earned it. Sophie didn't scream. She reached out, picking up a still warm piece of Silas's hand, the glass cutting deep into her palm. The horror had peaked, tipping over the edge of the abyss and landing squarely in a cold, homicidal clarity. She wasn't going to hide anymore. She was going to figure out where the Curator lived, and she was going to talk its ear off. Saturday morning in Seattle was characteristically grim, a persistent drizzle washing over the slick pavement of the financial district. The skyscraper that housed the firm was practically abandoned, a towering monolith of glass and steel asleep for the weekend. The Curator had told Sophie to take the weekend off. Sophie had other plans. She swiped her access badge, the pneumatic doors hissing open with a sound like a drawn breath. She was carrying a heavy, reinforced duffel bag. Inside were her laptop, a thermos of black coffee, and a tightly sealed Tupperware container holding the glowing, jagged shard of Silas's hand. She had bandaged her own palm with clinical detachment. The grief hadn't hit her yet. It was trapped behind a dam of pure, icy adrenaline and corporate rage. She took the elevator to the 42nd floor. The office was eerie in its emptiness. The monitors were black, the hum of the servers a low, constant vibration beneath her boots. She didn't go to her cubicle. She walked straight to the IT department's glass-walled enclosure, kicked the locking mechanism until it snapped, and sat down at the master terminal. If the Curator was using the firm's internal network to track engagement metrics, then the entity wasn't just a ghost. It was an administrator. And administrators had IP addresses. Administrators had protocols. Sophie cracked her knuckles and began to type. She didn't use an email client, she opened the master command prompt. She bypassed the firewalls with the ease of someone who had spent 5 years optimizing the firm's data structures, searching for the anomalous routing that had broadcast Silas's death to the board of observers. She found it hiding behind a proxy labeled Q3_aesthetic_audit. She didn't try to delete it. She knew better than to fight a cosmic entity with a backspace key. Instead, she weaponized the corporate bureaucracy. She highlighted the entire directory of the Board of Observers and created a mandatory, UN declinable calendar invite. Meeting, hostile takeover arbitration. Location, conference room C. Attendees, the Curator, the Board of Observers, Sophie. Agenda, if you don't show up, I will systematically crash the engagement servers and ruin your season finale. She hit send. The response was instantaneous. The master terminal screen didn't just glitch, it began to bleed. Thick, Pixelated crimson dripped from the top of the monitor, pooling at the bottom of the glass. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered and died, plunging the 42nd floor into twilight, illuminated only by the dull grey light bleeding through the rain-streaked windows. A new message slowly carved itself into the bloody screen. Out of office, the curator is currently unavailable. Please direct all queries to human resources. Nice try, Sophie whispered. She grabbed her duffel bag and stood up. As she stepped out of the IT enclosure, the building groaned. It wasn't a structural settling. It was the sound of a massive, living organism shifting its weight. The curator was awake, and it was annoyed. Sophie turned toward the hallway that led to conference room C, but she stopped dead. The hallway was wrong. The standard 30-foot corridor lined with frosted glass doors had stretched. It now extended into a terrifying, impossible vanishing point, zooming outward like a camera trick in a nightmare. The carpet had shifted from a dull grey weave to a pulsing, fleshy texture that looked uncomfortably like the lining of a throat. You want to play with the architecture? She thought. Fine. She took a step forward. The moment her boot hit the fleshy carpet, the geometry of the office violently rebelled. The ceiling above her abruptly angled downward, while the floor tilted up, turning the hallway into a claustrophobic, diamond-shaped tunnel. The frosted glass doors along the walls began to slide rapidly, shuffling like a deck of cards. Behind the glass, she could see silhouettes, not of her living co-workers, but of the curated dead. She saw Arthur, reassembled from his paper slices, pressing his flat, 2D hands against the glass. She saw the meat cube that used to be Julian, pulsating violently in the corner of an empty room. The building was a filing cabinet for the curse, and the curator was locking the drawers. Sophie didn't run. She walked with deliberate, heavy steps. The air grew thicker, smelling of ozone and rotting paper. The tunnel narrowed further, the walls closing in until her shoulders brushed against the frosted glass. The murmurs of the dead vibrated through the panes, a chorus of hushed, desperate voices begging her to speak to them, to give them one more sentence. I am not taking my PTO, Sophie announced to the empty, twisting corridor. Her voice was loud, steady, and utterly devoid of fear. I am clocking in. And you are going to give me my performance review right to my face. At the end of the impossible hallway, the heavy mahogany door of conference room C suddenly materialized, standing alone in the center of the shifting geometry. The door was slightly ajar. From within, the sound of radio static hissed, cold and expectant. The meeting had begun. The heavy mahogany door of conference room C didn't creak. It let out a low, digitized sigh as Sophie pushed it open. Inside, the corporate facade of the firm had completely collapsed. The long, polished table remained, but the walls of the room were gone. In their place was a vast, subterranean cavern of server racks constructed entirely from breathing, translucent bone and pulsing optical nerves. The air was frigid, smelling intensely of ozone and copper. At the head of the table sat the curator. Its bespoke charcoal suit was impeccable, but the void of static where its head should be was thrashing with violent, jagged lines of crimson interference. This is highly irregular, Sophie, the curator's voice vibrated directly into her teeth. You did not submit an agenda, and Saturday is my dedicated time for localized reality defragmentation. Sophie ignored it. She walked to the opposite end of the table and unzipped her reinforced duffel bag. She pulled out the Tupperware container and set it on the mahogany. Through the frosted plastic, the jagged shard of Silas's hand still emitted a faint, agonizingly warm amber glow. She looked up, not at the curator, but at the shadows beyond the table. Hovering in the dark abyss above the bone servers were the board of observers. They weren't humanoid. They were massive, unblinking, bloodshot eyes, each the size of a minivan, surrounded by a swirling halo of ticker tape that continuously printed out cosmic engagement metrics. You want a season finale? Sophie yelled, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. Let's do a live Q&A with the shareholders. The curator stood up, the static void snapping into a tight, furious spiral. Do not address the board directly, employee. They are strictly read-only. Watch me, Sophie sneered. She grabbed the Tupperware, snapped the lid off, and slammed Silas's glowing, crystalline hand onto the table. The glass shattered slightly, embedding brilliant, heated fragments into the wood. I want to file a formal grievance regarding the unauthorized restructuring of my date last night. The massive eyes shifted, their pupils dilating in unison to focus on Sophie. The ticker tape around them spun faster. A voice boomed from the ceiling, a chorus of 1,000 robotic, monotone voices speaking in perfect, terrifying unison. Grievance acknowledged. Employee 404, you are currently in violation of quarantine protocols. Please return to your designated sector. Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs, but a cold, sociopathic grin spread across her face. That was one. I'm not returning to my sector, Sophie shouted back, leaning over the table. I am formally requesting the immediate termination of my contract. Liquidate me. Fire me. Erase the curse. The curator lunged across the table, its suit glitching as it moved at an impossible, stuttering frame rate. Shut up. You don't know what you're doing. The algorithm is absolute. You cannot negotiate with the framework. Termination of your contract will result in the immediate molecular dispersion of your physical and digital assets, the board intoned, the giant eyes narrowing. Do you wish to proceed with absolute deletion? That was two. Sophie didn't blink. The loophole had always been there, staring her in the face since her first day at the firm. The curse was an automated system. It didn't have feelings. It didn't have loyalty. It had rules. And if anyone initiated 3 exchanges of dialogue with her, the universe had to correct them. It didn't matter if it was a junior analyst, a guy at a bus stop, or the cosmic shareholders themselves. She looked directly into the swirling static of the curator's non-face, then up at the giant, bloodshot eyes of the board. I don't want deletion, Sophie said, her voice dropping to a deadly, even whisper. I want a severance package. So I am going to stand right here, and I am going to wait for your answer. Tell me, board, is my severance approved? The curator screamed, a sound like dial-up internet being fed through a wood chipper. It scrambled backward, trying to disconnect, trying to pull the plug on the simulation. But the board was an automated bureaucracy, and bureaucracy always answers a direct query. Severance request is 3. The universe didn't stutter this time. It violently convulsed. A deafening, apocalyptic crack ripped through conference room C. The giant, bloodshot eyes of the board suddenly bulged in sheer, algorithmic panic. The curse had been triggered. The master framework was attempting to delete its own administrators. The massive eyes began to implode. The irises folded inward, sucking the sclera and the glowing ticker tape into a localized singularity. A sound like a million screaming hard drives echoed through the cavern as the board of observers was systematically crushed into perfect, geometric spheres of highly compressed cosmic data. They plummeted from the ceiling, crashing into the bone server racks, and shattering them into a million pieces of digital dust. The curator fell to its knees, clutching its static head. No. You've corrupted the root directory. You've initiated a hard wipe. The mahogany table began to dissolve into floating green code. The walls of the office building screamed as the spatial anomalies collapsed in on themselves. Sophie stood amidst the destruction, buttoning her coat as the floor beneath her began to pixelate. Consider this my 2 weeks' notice, she said, and turned toward the exit as reality unraveled behind her. The collapse of a cosmic, bureaucratic framework looks surprisingly like a failing hard drive. As Sophie walked toward the exit, the floor beneath her boots didn't shatter, it simply stopped rendering. The textured, fleshy carpet broke down into wireframes, then into floating, raw hexadecimal code. The deafening roar of the imploding board of observers faded into the high-pitched, pathetic whine of a cooling fan spinning its last rotation. Behind her, the curator was desperately trying to hold its physical form together. Its bespoke suit was tearing at the seams, revealing nothing but blinding, raw light beneath. The swirling static of its head had condensed into a single, blinking cursor. You can't do this, the curator shrieked, its voice dropping 3 octaves into a distorted, demonic bass, then pitching up into a frantic squeak. I have a 401k. I have stock options. If you delete the framework, who is going to manage the localized mortality rates? Sophie paused at the door frame, which was currently hovering in a white, endless void. She looked back at the glitching entity. I suggest you update your resume, Sophie said coldly. Because your department just got liquidated. The Curator opened its mouth to scream, but the universe finally caught up to the fatal error. With a sound like a television being violently unplugged, the Curator froze. A massive, glowing blue rectangle materialized over its body, displaying stark white text, Fatal System Error. Executing core dump. The entity was instantly compressed, flattening into a two-dimensional square, then a single line of pixels, and finally, a tiny, vibrating speck of light that simply popped out of existence. Then, everything went black. Sophie gasped, her lungs filling with the sharp, freezing scent of pine and exhaust fumes. She was standing on the sidewalk of 4th Avenue. The rain was pouring down, soaking through her coat. The towering skyscraper of the firm loomed beside her, completely intact, its glass facade reflecting the dull gray Seattle morning. She looked down at her hands. The Tupperware container was gone. In her right palm, resting against the bandage, was the small, jagged piece of amber glass from Silas's hand. It was no longer glowing. It was cold, silent, and entirely mundane. She had done it. She had crashed the system. The server was wiped, the board was dead, and the Curator was a deleted file. Sophie took a deep, shaky breath, closing her eyes and letting the rain wash over her face. For the first time in years, the crushing, invisible weight of the curse was gone. She wasn't a biological weapon anymore. She was just a woman, standing in the rain, profoundly alone. Excuse me, miss. Sophie's eyes snapped open. A young man wearing a bright yellow windbreaker and holding a clipboard was standing 3 feet away. He had the aggressively cheerful aura of a sidewalk charity mugger. I know it's raining, but do you have a minute for the environment? We're trying to save the Pacific Northwest tree frogs, and every little bit of awareness helps. My name is Toby, and I'd love to tell you about our new initiative. Sophie froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs. That was 3 sentences. She stared at Toby. Toby just stood there, smiling, rain dripping from his nose. So, what do you say? Care to sign a petition? He was fine. He was completely, frustratingly fine. The curse was truly gone. She opened her mouth to tell Toby, politely, that she wasn't interested. Before she could speak, her phone vibrated in her pocket. It wasn't a text message. It was a deep, physical thrum that resonated in her teeth, the exact same sensation the Curator used to project. Frowning, Sophie pulled her phone out. The screen was pitch black, except for a single line of glowing, neon green text. System reboot successful. Administrator Welcome, Sophie. Beneath the text, a small, blinking prompt appeared. Sophie stared at the screen. The rain seemed to stop mid-air. The universe hadn't deleted the bureaucracy. It had just promoted her to the top of the corporate ladder. She was no longer the weapon. She was the one pulling the trigger. She looked up at Toby. He was still smiling, oblivious, tapping his pen against his clipboard. Come on, it'll only take a second of your time, he pressed, completely unaware that his life was currently a yes or no prompt on a dripping iPhone. Sophie looked at the piece of Silas's glass in her hand. She thought about the meat cubes, the paper slices, and the horrific, endless noise of a city that never stopped demanding her attention. She thought about how much she absolutely hated small talk. A cold, corporate detachment settled over her shoulders like a familiar, comfortable coat. Sophie looked Toby dead in the eye, gave him a polite, razor-sharp smile, and pressed her thumb against the screen. Why? The world stuttered. And Toby's clipboard clattered to the ground as his windbreaker began to rapidly, violently shrink. Sophie turned on her heel and walked away, slipping her phone back into her pocket. The management had changed, but the office policy remained the same: do not disturb. Enjoying the story? Subscribe to Horcom After Dark for more late-night mysteries and horrors. The promotion suited her. 3 months after the system crash, Sophie found herself sitting in a corner booth of a high-end, minimalist cafe in downtown Seattle. The walls were painted a calming, muted sage, and the furniture was upholstered in soft cream leather. It was exactly the kind of quiet, curated aesthetic she appreciated. She took a slow sip of her iced matcha latte, her phone resting flat on the marble table. The screen wasn't showing emails from the firm. She had quit the day after she deleted the board. Instead, it displayed the master interface of the universe's reality correction algorithm, customized to her personal preferences. The old curator had been a middle management hack who relied on cheap, derivative gore. Meat cubes and paper slices lacked finesse. Sophie, fully embracing her new role as the apex predator of the cosmic food chain, treated the localized mortality rates like an art form. She was the architect of her own quiet, and she ruled her domain with the cold, unbothered grace of a true villainess. The cafe door swung open, shattering the peaceful ambience. A man in a fitted quarter-zip sweater walked in, talking loudly into a sleek headset. He ordered a black coffee, complained to the barista about the temperature, and then scanned the room. His eyes landed on Sophie. She was the only other person in the shop, radiating an icy, untouchable aura that, unfortunately, certain men always viewed as a challenge. He strutted over and slid into the cream leather chair opposite her, not bothering to ask if the seat was taken. "I don't usually do this, but I saw you sitting all the way over here by yourself and figured you could use some company." Sophie slowly lowered her matcha glass. She didn't flinch. 1. "I'm Trevor, by the way, and I just moved my tech startup into the building next door. It's pretty intense work, so it's always nice to meet someone who appreciates a good, quiet coffee break." 2. Sophie tapped her phone screen, waking up the admin terminal. A discreet, neon green prompt appeared over her lock screen. Target, Trevor_881 required. Awaiting third input. Trevor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the marble, completely misreading her silence as captive attention. "You're a great listener, you know that. We should definitely get out of here and grab a drink somewhere a little more lively." 3. Sophie didn't hesitate. She didn't feel the adrenaline panic she used to experience. She only felt the mild, administrative annoyance of swatting a fly. She selected the execution style from her newly designed, customized drop-down menu and pressed enter. The world didn't stutter. Under Sophie's management, the corrections were seamless. Trevor's smug smile froze. His vocal cords seized, emitting only a faint, high-pitched whirring sound, like an industrial sewing machine powering up. He didn't collapse. Instead, the tip of his right index finger unspooled. A single, microscopic thread of skin, bone, and capillary separated from his nail bed and shot upward into the air, caught by an invisible, rapidly spinning spindle. Trevor's eyes widened in sheer, mute terror as his finger began to unravel like a snagged sweater. The invisible mechanism worked with terrifying, automated speed. The biological thread zipped off his body, spinning tightly in the air above the table. His hand disappeared, deconstructed into a continuous, fibrous line of raw human material. Then his arm followed, the flesh and muscle separating cleanly without spilling a single drop of blood onto the pristine marble. Trevor tried to stand, but his legs were already unwinding. His torso gave way, his ribs and organs extruding into perfectly tensioned strands. In less than 8 seconds, the tech CEO was entirely spun out. The invisible spindle halted, gently dropping the finished product onto the cream leather chair. Sophie picked up her phone and cleared the notification. Correction complete. Aesthetic rating, flawless. She looked at the skein of Trevor resting politely on the chair. It was a vast improvement. No mess, no screaming bystanders, just a neat, quiet reorganization of matter. She made a mental note to catalog the tensile strength of the fiber later. It might be useful for a side project. Sophie took another sip of her matcha, relishing the absolute, unbroken silence of the cafe. The universe was finally learning its manners, and she had all the time in the world to enforce them. Sophie's apartment had become a sanctuary of absolute, curated control. She sat cross-legged on her velvet sofa, a pair of bamboo knitting needles clicking rhythmically in the quiet room. She was working the Trevor yarn into a thick, functional scrunchie. The material was surprisingly soft, though it retained a faint, eerie warmth. On the coffee table in front of her, her laptop was open to the universe's backend. The administrator interface didn't look like a spreadsheet or a terminal prompt. It looked remarkably like high-end video editing software. The fabric of reality was laid out in a multi-track timeline spanning across the bottom of the screen. Above it, a complex web of routing tools and fusion nodes dictated the physics and acoustics of her immediate radius. Sophie dragged a digital slider down, applying a localized audio mask to her apartment. The low, persistent rumble of Seattle traffic instantly vanished, replaced by a perfect, studio-quality silence. She adjusted the color grading of the sunlight filtering through her window, shifting the harsh gray overcast to a soft, diffuse pastel pink and cream twilight. She breathed out, her shoulders dropping. She set a 25-minute focus timer on the interface, a strict, uninterrupted interval of peace. If the system detected an unauthorized dialogue prompt during the countdown, it would auto-route the offender to the deletion bin. With 15 minutes left on the timer, her intercom buzzed. It was a jarring, abrasive sound that spiked into the red on her audio mixer track. Sophie paused her knitting. She didn't press the button to answer, but the building's antiquated speaker crackled to life anyway. Someone had bypassed the lobby lock. Sophie. It's Detective Vance, Seattle PD. I know you're in there. 1. Sophie stared at the intercom. A detective. Of course. You couldn't turn a dozen corporate professionals into office supplies, abstract art, and craft materials without eventually triggering an anomaly in the missing persons database. I have some questions about your former co-workers, specifically Arthur and Melissa. And a tech CEO named Trevor, who was last seen entering the cafe across the street from your building. 2. Sophie calmly set down her knitting needles and leaned over her laptop. She didn't feel cornered. She felt the mild annoyance of an editor finding a continuity error in the final cut. She clicked on the timeline, scrubbing forward a few seconds to anticipate Vance's next move. She saw the waveform of his voice preparing to generate the third sentence. She could have just let the automated system turn him into a puddle of biological ink, but Vance was law enforcement. That required a cleaner edit. She needed to remove the asset without leaving a mess for forensics. She selected his audio and visual tracks on the timeline, opened the masking tool, and drew a tight, digital perimeter around his presence in the hallway. I have a warrant, Sophie, so if you don't open this door, I'm going to have building maintenance open it for me. 3. Sophie didn't hit delete. She hit extract and archive. Out in the hallway, Detective Vance didn't explode or collapse. He was subjected to a brutal, localized rendering failure. A glowing, two-dimensional grid materialized in the air around him, framing his body like a crop tool. Vance stopped speaking, his eyes darting frantically as the edges of his vision became jagged, transparent checkerboards, the universal background of empty digital space. What the? He managed to choke out, but the sound was abruptly muted as Sophie unlinked his audio track from reality. With a rapid, agonizing zip, the cropping tool collapsed inward. Vance was systematically detached from the physical world. His skin, uniform, and badge didn't bleed. They were converted into raw, uncompressed media assets. His skeleton snapped into a series of rigid, white vector lines before collapsing into a single keyframe. In a fraction of a second, the detective was yanked out of the three-dimensional plane entirely, leaving behind a gaping, human-shaped hole in the hallway that briefly exposed the terrifying, pitch-black void of the universe's root directory. Then, the hallway's background smoothly rendered over the hole, stitching the floral wallpaper and the carpet back together flawlessly. On Sophie's laptop, a new folder popped up in the media pool. It was labeled asset_vance.zip. Inside were 3 subfolders, one for his physical mass, neatly converted into a gigabyte of dense bone meal, one for his audio, a clean track of muffled, terrified screaming, and one containing a perfectly preserved, high-resolution JPEG of his police badge. Sophie dragged the audio track into the trash bin and emptied it. She routed the bone meal to the city's nearest municipal garden via a spatial node, ensuring the hydrangeas would look spectacular this spring. The 25-minute focus timer on her screen chimed softly, signaling the end of her session. Sophie smiled, stretching her arms above her head. She picked up her bamboo needles and the Trevor yarn, casting on the next row. The city was finally starting to respect her boundaries, and her apartment had never felt so peaceful. The problem with being the administrator of a localized reality is that manual data entry eventually becomes tedious. It was a rare, aggressively sunny Sunday in Seattle, the kind of day that dragged the entire city out of its damp hibernation. Sophie was standing by her floor-to-ceiling windows, wearing her Trevor yarn scrunchie, and sipping a pour-over coffee. She was enjoying the muted, color-graded pastel aesthetic she had applied to the skyline when the piece was shattered by a sound that bypassed her audio filters entirely, a synchronized, bass-heavy thumping. She looked down at the street below. A massive, unpermitted flash mob had cordoned off the intersection directly in front of her building. There were at least 80 people dressed in matching neon pink tracksuits, holding up ring lights, and dancing in a chaotic, synchronized routine. At the center of the mob stood a woman with a blindingly white smile, holding a megaphone and a gimbal-mounted smartphone. She was an engagement farming influencer, and she was live streaming a massive, public nuisance. Sophie sighed, setting her coffee down. She walked over to her laptop, which rested on a sleek acrylic standing desk. The administrator dashboard was already flashing yellow, detecting a massive surge in ambient, unfocused communication intent. Down on the street, the influencer pointed her megaphone directly up at Sophie's window. "Hey, you up there on the 4th floor?" "Yeah, the lady in the window, we're doing a live giveaway for our brand new wellness app." 1. Sophie watched the dashboard. A single dialogue node popped up on her screen, labeled user_Kiki_live. But because Kiki was broadcasting to 80 people in the street and thousands online, the node immediately began to branch. Hundreds of tiny, parasitic dialogue prompts populated Sophie's screen as the crowd and the viewers directed their collective attention toward her. "All you have to do is come down here, get on the MIC, and tell my followers what you're doing to spread positivity today." Kiki's voice echoed off the glass of the surrounding skyscrapers, piercing and relentless. 2. The yellow flashing on Sophie's dashboard turned to a critical, strobing red. "Warning, mass dialogue intent detected. 7,402 concurrent exchanges initiated." Sophie didn't panic. A few months ago, this would have been a catastrophic systemic overload. But she wasn't a victim of the algorithm anymore, she was an engineer. And engineers know that when you have thousands of repetitive tasks, you don't do them manually. You write a macro. She opened the master command terminal, her fingers flying across the keyboard in a blur of detached efficiency. She didn't want to execute 7,000 individual deletions that would spike the city's missing persons database and ruin the clean aesthetic of her neighborhood. She needed something functional. Something permanent. "Don't be shy, come on down and let's have a chat." Kiki screamed into the megaphone, waving her arms in wide, frantic arcs. 3. Sophie hit Ctrl+A to select the entire mob, opened a drop-down menu of architectural presets, selected organic_acoustic_baffle_v2, and slammed the Enter key. The bass-heavy music cut out so fast it created a vacuum. Down on the street, Kiki and her 80 neon-clad dancers didn't dissolve or explode. They underwent a synchronized, grid-based rendering shift. The neon-pink fabric of their tracksuits violently fused with their skin, melting into a dense, rubbery polymer. Kiki's jaw locked open, the plastic of her megaphone liquefying and pouring down her throat like hot wax, sealing her vocal cords shut. The crowd didn't even have time to register the horror. With a chorus of wet, synchronized snapping, their skeletal structures elongated. Their spines stretched backward, their arms fusing to the people standing next to them. The 80 bodies rapidly braided together, spiraling upward from the asphalt like a grotesque, rapidly growing vine. They were systematically woven into a thick, highly dense wall of biological acoustic foam, wrapping perfectly around the wrought iron perimeter of Sophie's apartment complex. Their faces were pressed flat against the outer layer, forever frozen in mid-cheer, their eyes wide and blind, serving as sound-dampening nodes. In less than 12 seconds, the flash mob had been repurposed into a 12-foot-high, soundproof privacy hedge. On Sophie's screen, the red warning lights shifted to a calming, stable green. Batch process complete. Ambient noise reduced by 98.4%. Sophie closed the laptop. The silence in the apartment was absolute, profound, and heavy. She walked back to the window and looked down at her new landscaping. The neon pink, fleshy hedge absorbed the sounds of the distant traffic perfectly. It was efficient, it was zero maintenance, and it sent a very clear message to the neighborhood. She picked up her pour-over coffee, the liquid still perfectly warm. She took a slow sip, looking out over the gray, drizzly Seattle skyline. The city was full of noise, full of endless, desperate people begging to be heard. But up here, in the corner office of reality, Sophie had finally achieved the ultimate corporate dream. Total, uninterrupted bandwidth. The aesthetic of absolute power was, in Sophie's opinion, best enjoyed with a high-speed internet connection and a freshly brewed Americano. She was sitting at her acrylic standing desk, browsing high-end ergonomic chairs, when the air in the center of her living room simply split open. It didn't tear or burn, it unzipped like a faulty panoramic photo, exposing a vertical strip of gray, digitized nothingness. A man stepped out of the rift. He wore a tailored navy suit, a crisp white shirt, and a lanyard bearing a gold-plated keycard. In his right hand, he was holding a terrified, pimple-faced teenager wearing a local pizza delivery uniform by the scruff of his neck. Sophie didn't reach for a weapon. She casually moved her cursor over to the administrator dashboard, keeping her eyes on the intruder. "Do you mind?" Sophie said, her tone dripping with corporate disdain. "I just ran the air purifier." The man in the navy suit didn't speak. He smiled a shark-like grin and tapped the side of his own throat, then pointed to the delivery boy. He gave the teenager a vicious shake. The kid, trembling so violently he could barely hold the pizza box, read from a fluorescent pink index card forced into his hand. Hello, Sophie. My name is Elias, and I am the regional director of the Pacific Time Zone's visual domain." Sophie raised an eyebrow. A rival admin, Elias was clearly overseeing the visual equivalent of her audio curse, and he was smart enough to know that if he spoke to her directly, he'd trigger her system. So, he had brought a burner phone. A human one. Elias snapped his fingers. The teenager sobbed, reading the second card. "I've noticed a massive uptick in your localized efficiency, and I'm here to propose a merger." That was two. Sophie leaned back in her chair. She had to admit, the ruthless pragmatism of using an expendable civilian to bypass the dialogue threshold was a brilliant bit of corporate loophole exploitation. "I'm not interested in a merger," Sophie replied evenly. "I have a monopoly here. I don't need a co-founder." Elias rolled his eyes, a theatrical sigh escaping his lips. He squeezed the back of the teenager's neck, forcing him to read the final card. With our combined bandwidth, we could automate the mortality algorithms for the entire West Coast, creating perfect, uninterrupted. 3. The delivery boy didn't even get to finish the pitch. The universe executed a localized file compression. The teenager's spine snapped inward with the deafening crack of a felled oak. He didn't have time to scream as the physics engine violently zipped him. His limbs folded, telescoping into his own ribcage, while his skin pulled taut and compressed. In less than 3 seconds, the delivery boy, the uniform, and the large pepperoni pizza were crushed into a hyper-dense, perfectly smooth, 1-inch cube that dropped to the hardwood floor with a heavy clack. Elias didn't flinch. He just brushed a speck of invisible dust off his lapel, reached his hand back into the grey rift behind him, and dragged out a second, equally terrified hostage. a middle-aged woman wearing a barista apron. Sophie's eyes narrowed. Elias was treating human lives like disposable chat tokens. It was incredibly wasteful, and more importantly, it was cluttering her floor. Elias thrust a new stack of pink index cards into the weeping barista's hands. "I read it," the woman choked out, staring at the tiny cube on the floor. He says, "Come now, Sophie, think of the synergy." 1. "You're making a mess in my office, Elias," Sophie warned, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. Elias smirked, raising his own hands. His fingertips began to glow with a blinding, white-hot light. He was booting up his visual admin privileges. He was planning a hostile takeover. If she looked at his hands for too long, her own optic nerves would likely be reformatted. "Read the next one," Elias hissed at the barista, violently shaking her. He says, "If you decline, I will simply initiate a localized wipe and reassign your sector to myself." 2. "Bold pitch," Sophie muttered. She didn't look at Elias's glowing hands. She looked at her monitor. She opened her master directory, navigated to the active_entities folder, and found the file labeled elias_admin_visual.exe. He was an executable file. He thought he was a program running the show. "Read the last card," Elias commanded, the light from his hands now filling the room, preparing to blind and delete her. He says. The barista squeezed her eyes shut, screaming the final line. "Consider this a hostile acquisition." 3. The system triggered. But Sophie didn't let the automated algorithm take the wheel. She intervened manually. As the universe prepared to compress the barista into another zip file, Sophie clicked on the barista's profile and hit Ignore Exception. The woman gasped, collapsing to the floor, completely unharmed. Elias blinked, his glowing hands dimming in confusion. He looked at the surviving barista, then at Sophie. His mouth opened in silent shock. He had just realized a terrifying truth about corporate hierarchies: his admin privileges were regional. Sophie's were root. Sophie highlighted elias_admin_visual.exe. She didn't press delete. Deletion was too merciful for a man who interrupted her coffee break. She right-clicked, scrolled down to Change File Extension, and typed .mp3. "Let's reassign you to ambient noise," Sophie whispered, and hit enter. Elias's bespoke suit instantly liquefied into a puddle of black, oily frequency waves. His skin peeled back, revealing not muscle or bone, but vibrating concentric rings of raw audio data. He finally tried to scream, but because he was no longer a physical entity, his vocal cords had been converted into pure, digital white noise. His physical form spiraled down into the floorboards, flattening out, until he was nothing more than a localized, invisible audio track looping endlessly in the corner of her living room. The gray rift in the air snapped shut. Sophie stood up and walked over to the sobbing barista. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and tucked it into the pocket of the woman's apron. "The exit is down the hall," Sophie said gently, pointing to her front door. "Please take the cube with you on your way out. Toss it in the recycling bin." The barista nodded frantically, scooped up the hyper-dense cube of the delivery boy, and sprinted out of the apartment, slamming the door behind her. Sophie walked back to her desk and listened to the new ambient noise radiating from the corner of her living room. Elias's agonized, digital screaming had been automatically equalized by her system. It sounded exactly like the gentle, soothing hum of a high-end HEPA air purifier. She took a sip of her coffee, deeply satisfied. The synergy was perfect. Absolute control over the fabric of reality was a beautiful thing, but it didn't exempt Sophie from the true apex predators of civilized society, the HOA. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Elias the air purifier was humming a soothing, steady loop of white noise in the corner, and the neon-pink acoustic hedge outside was perfectly blocking the sounds of Seattle traffic. Sophie was at her kitchen island, using a pair of silver tweezers to delicately build a terrarium inside a hollowed-out, crystallized skull she had saved from an early experiment. A sharp, authoritative rapping echoed from her front door. It wasn't the polite, hesitant knock of a delivery driver, nor the aggressive pounding of law enforcement. It was the staccato rhythm of middle management indignation. Sophie sighed, setting her tweezers down. She picked up her tablet, pulled up the localized admin dashboard, and walked to the door. Standing in the hallway was Barbara, the president of the building's homeowners association. She was a woman who weaponized beige knitwear, and possessed a haircut that defied gravity. She was holding a clipboard with a death grip, her lips pursed so tightly they had practically vanished. I am issuing a formal, Class A citation for the unauthorized, pulsating biological structure currently wrapped around your balcony railing, Barbara announced, thrusting the clipboard toward Sophie's chest. 1. Sophie didn't look at the clipboard. She looked down at her tablet. Target, Barbara_HOA_lead acquired. Threat level, pedestrian. Barbara's eyes narrowed, offended by the lack of immediate groveling. The bylaws, which you signed, I might add, clearly state that all exterior foliage must be approved by the architectural committee, and neon pink is absolutely not on the approved heritage color palette. 2. Sophie swiped left on Barbara's profile, bringing up the environmental integration menu. You see, Barbara, Sophie said mildly, not looking up from the screen, that hedge is a functional noise cancellation macro. It provides exceptional utility. I do not care if it cures diseases. If you do not remove that grotesque eyesore by 5 o'clock today, the committee will be forced to place a lien on your property and initiate eviction proceedings. 3. Sophie didn't blink. She selected a preset labeled structural_compliance_V4 and tapped execute. Barbara opened her mouth to continue her tirade, but her jaw suddenly locked with the heavy, grinding sound of two stones dragging against each other. The color drained from her beige knitwear, her skin, and her hair, rapidly homogenizing into a stark, HOA-approved shade of eggshell white. Barbara's eyes widened in horror as her legs snapped together, the fabric of her skirt fusing with her shins and feet. A terrifying, heavy calcification swept upward from her toes. She wasn't just turning to stone, she was being aggressively reproposed into architecture. Her base widened, anchoring heavily into the plush hallway carpet. Her torso began to stretch, elongating with a sickening, wet crunch of bone that was quickly muted by the hardening marble. Her arms slammed rigidly against her sides, fusing into her waist to form the smooth, fluted lines of a classical pillar. MMPH. Barbara tried to scream, but her face was stretching upward, her features flattening and smoothing out as her head hit the hallway ceiling. Her hair curled outward, solidifying into the ornate, carved leaves of a Corinthian capital. In less than 6 seconds, the HOA president was gone. In her place stood a flawless, floor-to-ceiling load-bearing marble column, perfectly supporting the structural beam above Sophie's doorway. If one looked very, very closely at the top of the pillar, they could just barely make out the faint, bas-relief expression of a woman in a state of eternal, outraged shock. Sophie tilted her head, admiring the craftsmanship of the universe's rendering engine. The column was perfectly symmetrical, tasteful, and entirely compliant with the building's neutral color palette. She picked up the clipboard that had clattered to the floor, checked the box marked resolved, and placed it neatly at the base of the new pillar. Her tablet chimed. Localized aesthetic updated. Property value increased by 2.4%. Sophie smiled. She stepped back inside, letting the heavy oak door click shut, and went back to her terrarium. She really did love this neighborhood. The problem with creating a localized utopia is that perfection eventually attracts investors. It was a quiet Thursday. Sophie was sitting at her acrylic desk, admiring the way the afternoon light refracted through the Silas glass terrarium, when her laptop screen flickered. The administrator dashboard didn't crash, but a forced override punched through her firewall. A video call window expanded to fill the screen. Sitting in a stark, minimalist office that screamed Silicon Valley, was a man in his late 40s wearing a black turtleneck and frameless glasses. He had the aggressively calm, micro-dosed aura of a venture capitalist who believed he could optimize God. Good afternoon, Sophie, the man said, steepling his fingers. My name is Marcus, and I'll keep this brief, as my analysts have already reverse engineered the three-strike syntax of your unique algorithm. 1. Sophie didn't reach for the trackpad. She just took a slow sip of her sparkling water, watching a new node labeled Marcus_VC_Tier 1 populate on her dashboard. Marcus leaned into the camera, his eyes gleaming with greedy, disruptive vision. I was the primary seed investor for Trevor's startup, and while I mourn the loss of his leadership, the tensile strength of the biological yarn he became is going to absolutely revolutionize the luxury textiles market. 2. Sophie raised an eyebrow. That was actually a fair point. The Trevor yarn was exceptionally durable. I have transferred $50 million into an offshore account in your name, Marcus continued, a smug, winner-takes-all smile spreading across his face. In exchange, I want exclusive distribution rights to your biomaterials, and I want you on a permanent retainer to restructure my competitors. 3. The dashboard flashed green. External query detected. Awaiting administrator action. Sophie set her glass down. Marcus was waiting, fully expecting her to nod, or to type an acceptance. He thought he had bought out the universe's root admin for the price of a mid-sized yacht. He fundamentally misunderstood the economy of her new reality. Money was an abstract concept. She possessed literal control over matter. Sophie didn't say a word. She moved her cursor over to the drop-down menu, bypassing the organic_repurposing folder, and opening the Asset Liquidation tab. She selected heavy_metals_conversion, and clicked Execute. Through the video feed, Sophie watched Marcus's smug smile falter. The color in his webcam feed desaturated, plunging into a stark, metallic monochrome. What are you? Marcus gasped, grabbing the edge of his mahogany desk. He didn't scream. The conversion was too dense for acoustics. His black turtleneck suddenly tightened as his body mass exponentially increased. His skin lost its elasticity, hardening and darkening into the cold, polished sheen of solid tungsten. His eyes widened, the pupils freezing into brilliant, reflective silver. With a sickening, heavy crunch that cracked the lens of his webcam, Marcus's skeleton collapsed under its own sudden, impossible gravity. His limbs didn't fold, they melted inward, pooling into the center of his mass. His torso rounded out, his head sinking into his chest as the molten tungsten bone alloy formed a perfect, seamless sphere. The heavy sphere dropped, smashing straight through his solid mahogany desk, shattering his laptop, and crashing into the floorboards with a devastating thud that shook the camera feed before it went black. Sophie checked her dashboard. Liquidation complete. Mass compressed. Density, maximum. She clicked the spatial_routing tool, highlighted the newly formed sphere at Marcus's GPS coordinates, and dragged it to her own desktop folder. A localized spatial rift, a tiny, muted zip in the air, opened above her acrylic desk. A heavy, perfectly smooth sphere of polished tungsten and bone alloy dropped onto her desk pad with a solid, satisfying clack. It was cold to the touch, roughly the size of a billiard ball, and completely flawless. A tiny, silver loop protruded from the top. Sophie picked it up, weighing it in her hand. It was remarkably heavy. It was exactly what she needed. She opened a velvet-lined box sitting on the corner of her desk. Inside was a sleek, silver frame, the scaffolding for an executive Newton's cradle. She had ordered it empty, specifically waiting for the right materials. She attached the Marcus sphere to the first set of suspended strings. It hung perfectly, a silent testament to the hubris of venture capitalism. Sophie spun her chair around, looking at the empty slots on the cradle. She needed 4 more spheres to complete the set, which meant she needed to find 4 more billionaires who thought they could buy out the universe. She smiled, tapping her keyboard to unblock the rest of the incoming calls from Silicon Valley. Let's take some pitches, she whispered to the empty room. Unblocking the Silicon Valley routing queue was like opening the floodgates of a highly caffeinated, venture-backed hell. Sophie's dashboard immediately lit up with dozens of incoming video requests. She bypassed the standard waiting room, setting her admin status to available, and let the algorithm auto-accept the highest bidder. The screen flickered, revealing three men squeezed together onto a single leather sofa inside a glass-walled WeWork office. A neon sign buzzing with the word hustle glowed aggressively behind them. They were wearing identical Patagonia fleece vests over button-down shirts, radiating the terrifying, synchronized energy of a tech bro hive mind. Sophie, incredible to finally connect with you, the one on the left, whose on-screen name read Logan_CEO, said with a blindingly white smile. We've been analyzing the localized data anomalies in Seattle, and we think we've found a way to synergize your deletion algorithms with the blockchain. 1. Sophie didn't blink. She picked up a microfiber cloth and gently polished the Marcus sphere hanging on her Newton's cradle. She needed 4 more to complete the set. 3 men sitting shoulder to shoulder was a stroke of logistical luck. The guy in the middle, Hunter_CTO, leaned aggressively into the webcam, his eyes wide with disruptive zeal. We're calling it DAS, Death as a Service, a fully decentralized protocol where users can mint their enemies into smart contract NFTs the moment your system compresses their physical assets. 2. Sophie's cursor drifted lazily across the screen, hovering over the Asset Liquidation tab. The system dashboard flashed green, recognizing the collective dialogue intent from the trio. They were so perfectly aligned in their corporate jargon that the universe registered them as a single, annoying entity. The third man on the right, Bryce_CFO, clapped his hands together, sealing their fate. If you hand over the root API keys today, we can fast-track the ICO by Q3, corner the global mortality market, and make you a billionaire in fiat by Tuesday. 3. I prefer tangible assets, Sophie murmured. She highlighted the entire video feed, selected them heavy_metals_conversion macro, and set the batch quantity to 3. She hit enter. The neon hustle sign behind them flickered and died as the localized physics engine violently asserted itself inside the WeWork office. Logan, Hunter, and Bryce stopped smiling simultaneously. The healthy, micro-dosed pink flush of their skin rapidly drained, replaced by the dull, impenetrable gray of solid tungsten. Wait, why is my vest? Logan managed to clink out, his voice sounding like a spoon tapping against a cast iron skillet. They didn't have time to run. The heavy gravity of the macro hit them all at once. The leather sofa groaned and snapped under the sudden, massive weight increase. Their limbs liquefied into a dense, molten alloy, drawing their mass inward. The 3 tech bros collapsed into themselves, smoothing out into 3 perfectly uniform, hyper-dense spheres of solid metal. They smashed through the floor of the WeWork office in unison, disappearing from the camera feed just before Sophie closed the window. A moment later, 3 tiny, muted spatial rifts unzipped above her acrylic desk. Clack. 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 The spheres dropped onto her desk pad, perfectly identical to the Marcus sphere, complete with the little silver loops at the top. They were still slightly warm from the conversion friction. Sophie picked them up one by one, carefully stringing them onto the silver frame of the Newton's cradle. She now had 4 spheres hanging in perfect, suspended alignment. She reached out and pulled the Marcus sphere back, letting it drop against the others. Clack. The kinetic energy transferred flawlessly through Logan and Hunter, kicking Bryce outward on the other side with a rhythmic, soothing swing. Clack. 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 Sophie watched the executive toy swing back and forth, the heavy tungsten spheres clicking together in a perfect, hypnotic rhythm. It was a beautiful piece of desk decor, but the frame looked slightly unbalanced. There was exactly 1 empty hook left on the far right side of the cradle. She needed 1 more. But she didn't want another venture capitalist. For the centerpiece of her collection, she needed someone truly special. She needed someone who had been annoying her since day 1. She opened her master directory, typed a name into the search bar, and smiled as a location ping lit up on the map, just a few blocks away. Arthur was still dead, Melissa was still digesting herself, but there was one loose end from the old firm, who had somehow managed to survive the transition of power. It was time to pay Julian a visit. The problem with the old Curator's file management system was that it lacked backward compatibility. The meat cubes, paper slices, and glass statues had all been dumped into an unorganized legacy folder labeled archived_assets_Q1 Q3. Sophie sat on her velvet sofa, scrolling through the old directory on her tablet. She scrolled past Arthur's paper slices and Silas's glass shards. Finally, buried near the bottom of the folder, she found it, asset_Julian_busstop.cube. She highlighted the file, dragged it into her active workspace, and set the spawn coordinates for the center of her living room rug. Let's see if the unzipping protocol works on organic matter, Sophie murmured, tapping extract. The air above her rug shimmered with green code. A heavy, wet thump echoed through the apartment as a perfect, briefcase-sized cube of compressed bone, gore, and polyester dropped onto the floor. It pulsed slightly, emitting a faint, muffled groan. Sophie selected the cube and clicked Restore to Previous Version. The rendering engine whined as it processed the massive spatial calculation. The cube began to unfold. It was a reverse playback of the horror at the bus stop. Bones snapped back into alignment with loud, wet pops. Organs liquefied, re-inflating like gruesome balloons. Skin stretched out of its leather-tight compression, snapping back over the skeleton. With a final, desperate gasp of air, Julian materialized in the center of her living room. He was on his hands and knees, wearing his starched raincoat, dripping with a thin, iridescent layer of rendering fluid. He coughed violently, wiping the fluid from his eyes. He looked around the pristine, color-graded apartment, then up at Sophie, who was calmly sipping her matcha latte from the sofa. Julian was a man who had spent the last several months compressed into a 40-centimeter box of his own viscera. A normal person would have been weeping, screaming, or catatonic. But Julian was a career middle manager from Seattle. His default emotional state was profound, aggrieved irritation. He struggled to his feet, brushing off his raincoat. What on earth just happened? Julian demanded, his face flushing red. 1 minute I'm waiting for the 402, and the next I'm jammed in some freezing dark closet for what feels like a fiscal quarter. 1. Sophie smiled. The counter had reset. You've been in long-term storage, Julian. We're migrating you to a new server. Julian scoffed, looking down at his ruined clothes. Long-term storage. Look at my suit, this is bespoke Italian wool, and it is completely ruined with whatever this disgusting slime is. 2. It's rendering fluid. It'll dry, Sophie said, her finger hovering over the tablet. She opened the heavy_metals_conversion macro. Julian took a step toward her, pointing an angry, trembling finger. I don't care what it is. I demand to know who is in charge here, because I am absolutely filing a grievance with the City Transit Authority. 3. Sophie didn't even look up from her screen. She just tapped execute. And another th, Julian started, but his voice abruptly clinked into a dull, metallic chime. The color drained out of his ruined bespoke suit, rapidly shifting into the heavy, polished gray of solid tungsten. Julian's angry expression froze, his eyes locking in sudden, crushing panic as his body mass multiplied by 1,000. He didn't have time to process the physics. The sheer weight of the conversion pulled him downward. His torso melted inward, his limbs folding into a perfectly smooth, hyper-dense sphere. Thud. The Julian sphere hit the floor, driving a perfectly round dent into the hardwood. It was flawless. Sophie set her tablet down, walked over, and picked up the incredibly heavy sphere. She carried it to her acrylic standing desk and attached it to the fifth and final hook on her silver Newton's cradle. It hung perfectly in line with Marcus, Logan, Hunter, and Bryce. Sophie reached out, pulling the Julian sphere back as far as the string would allow. She let it go. Clack. Julian hit Bryce. The kinetic energy rippled through the tech bros in the center, and Marcus kicked outward on the far side in a flawless, smooth arc. Clack. 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 The 5 aggrieved men swung back and forth, clicking together in a soothing, endless rhythm. Sophie leaned against her desk, listening to the rhythmic clicking and the gentle white noise of the Elias air purifier. The visual aesthetic was clean. The audio environment was perfect. She had taken the chaotic, messy curse of the universe and engineered it into a masterpiece of corporate minimalism. But as she watched the spheres swing, her dashboard suddenly flashed with a severe, system-wide alert. The light wasn't yellow, and it wasn't red. It was a blinding, pure white. Warning, root directory breach. Unauthorized override in progress. The Newton's cradle abruptly stopped mid-swing. The spheres froze in the air, defying gravity. The white noise of the air purifier cut out. Sophie's blood ran cold. She wasn't the only administrator on the server anymore. The pristine, studio-quality silence of Sophie's apartment shattered with the sound of a drawn blade. It wasn't a digital sound effect. It was the terrifying, physical scrape of metal against a scabbard, echoing so loudly it made the floorboards vibrate. On her acrylic desk, the 5 tungsten spheres of her Newton's cradle remained perfectly suspended in mid-air, defying gravity. The universe had been paused by a command prompt with a higher security clearance than her own. Sophie's dashboard turned from its sleek, modern neon green to a blinding, imperial gold. A new warning banner scrolled across the screen in an elegant, calligraphic font. Critical error, root directory merge completed. Sector 4, Ancient Martial or Celestial, has overwritten Sector 1, Modern Corporate. Transmigration protocol engaged. The wall of her living room didn't pixelate or glitch. It was simply cleaved in half. A massive, invisible force sliced through the drywall, the glass windows, and the neon-pink acoustic hedge outside, parting the structure like paper. Through the rift stepped a man, who fundamentally did not belong in a Seattle high-rise. He radiated the suffocating, blood-soaked aura of an ancient battlefield commander. He was tall, his broad shoulders squared with military precision, and his long, dark hair was tied back with a crimson silk ribbon. Yet, in a jarring clash of realities, he wasn't wearing armor. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored, charcoal 3-piece suit over a black silk tunic, holding a translucent corporate tablet in one hand and a terrifyingly sharp, 3-foot straight sword in the other. He was a literal god of war, transmigrated into middle management. He stepped into her carefully curated, sage green and cream living room, his dark eyes sweeping over the minimalist decor with profound disdain. "Is this sterile little box the domain of the rogue administrator?" his voice boomed. It didn't register on her audio mixer. It bypassed the digital framework entirely, vibrating with the sheer, arrogant weight of celestial authority. 1. Sophie didn't reach for her coffee. She kept her hands perfectly still over her keyboard. She highlighted his physical form and dragged it into the threat assessment window. Target, Director_Gen_God of War. Threat level, Transcendent. Director Gen lazily rested the flat of his blade against his shoulder. He looked at the frozen Newton's cradle, scoffing at the suspended tungsten spheres. "You shattered the board of observers, destabilized the server walls, and forced a cosmic merger, just so you could play arts and crafts with your local executives." 2. Sophie's fingers flew across the keys. She didn't bother with the heavy metals macro. A god of war wouldn't be slowed down by gravity. She opened the Asset Liquidation tab, selected the absolute, most destructive command in her arsenal, 0_point_erasure, and queued it up. Director Gen locked eyes with her, a cold, predatory smirk touching his lips. He didn't look like a man who feared a digital algorithm. He looked like a man who conquered them. "By the decree of the Heavenly Emperor's Corporate Oversight Committee, your sector is hereby seized, and your administrative privileges are revoked." 3. Sophie slammed the enter key. The universe executed the command. A localized black hole, a sphere of absolute, devouring nothingness, materialized directly inside Director Gen's chest. It was designed to rip a target out of the timeline, deleting their code at a subatomic level. The black hole spun, screaming as it tried to consume him. Gen didn't even flinch. He didn't turn to stone, or glass, or zip files. He just stood there, his suit unwrinkled, as the erasure command ground to a halt against an invisible, shimmering barrier that flared around his body. A new, Terrifying error message popped up on Sophie's screen. System override. Execution failed. Target possesses plot armor, rank S. Celestial aura deflects all standard algorithms. The black hole shattered like brittle glass, the digital fragments raining down onto the hardwood floor and fading into nothingness. Jian chuckled, the sound deep and devoid of humor. He tapped his translucent tablet, and the sword in his hand dissolved into a glowing streak of golden data, absorbing into the silk of his suit. Your modern parlor tricks are useless against a celestial mandate, Sophie, Jian said, stepping closer to her acrylic desk. I have fought through 3 lifetimes, conquered the 9 heavens, and survived a hostile corporate takeover of the Jade Palace. A mere deletion script cannot pierce my plot armor. Sophie stared at the error message on her screen. The cold, sociopathic calm that had defined her reign for the past 3 months fractured just a little. The system rules had changed. She couldn't just click and delete anymore. Director Jian leaned over her desk, placing his hands flat on the acrylic. His aura was overwhelmingly heavy, smelling of incense and ozone. You have until Monday, at 9 a.m., to pack up your little terrariums and vacate the server, the God of War whispered. If you are not gone by the start of the fiscal week, I will not delete you. I will demote you to the mortal realm's customer service queue. He didn't wait for a response. Jian turned, his suit jacket billowing like a war cape, and walked back through the rift. The cleaved walls of her apartment instantly snapped back together, sealing the breach. The Newton's cradle unfroze with a loud clack. The Elias air purifier resumed its gentle humming. Sophie sat in the silence, staring at the empty space where the transmigrated director had just threatened her. The golden error message slowly faded from her screen, replaced by a ticking countdown clock to Monday morning. She looked at her tungsten spheres, her pink acoustic hedge, and her perfectly quiet, pastel sanctuary. Customer service, she whispered, a slow, terrifying smile creeping across her face. She cracked her knuckles, pulling up the universe's raw source code. She had the weekend to figure out how to bypass rank S plot armor, and she knew exactly where to start. If a God of War wanted a corporate battle, she was going to give him the most ruthless performance review in the history of the cosmos. Monday morning arrived with the sterile, uncompromising punctuality of an automated calendar alert. At 8:59 a.m., Sophie sat at her acrylic desk. Her apartment was immaculate. The Elias air purifier hummed its soothing white noise, and the Newton's cradle was perfectly still. On her laptop, the administrator dashboard was stripped of all its usual macros. No heavy metals, no zip files, no biological knitting. She had spent 72 straight hours reading the universe's raw, celestial source code. She had learned a fundamental truth about S-rank plot armor. It was an absolute defense mechanism designed to protect the user from damage, death, and erasure. If an attack registered as a threat to his hit points or his existence, the plot armor would deflect it. But Sophie wasn't an assassin. She was an HR administrator. And human resources didn't kill you, they just reassigned you. At exactly 9 a.m., the air in her living room tore open in a blaze of blinding, imperial gold. Director Jian stepped through the rift. He looked even more imposing than Friday, his charcoal 3-piece suit practically vibrating with martial energy. He had traded his straight sword for a massive, terrifying halberd that crackled with blue lightning. The deadline has passed, Administrator, Jian boomed, the sheer force of his voice rattling the crystal terrarium on her kitchen island. I see you haven't packed your belongings. 1. Sophie didn't look at the halberd. She looked at his metadata. Hovering above his head, visible only through her admin interface, were his core tags: role, protagonist, genre, xianxia, action, alignment, God of War. I reviewed the corporate handbook over the weekend, Director, Sophie said, resting her chin on her hands. It turns out, we don't have the budget for a God of War in the Seattle regional office. Jian scoffed, slamming the butt of his halberd into her hardwood floor. The wood didn't splinter, it vaporized into a crater of raw energy. Do you truly believe your petty corporate loopholes can bind a man who has severed the heavens and forced demons to bow? 2. Sophie's finger hovered over the enter key. She had written a custom script, a bureaucratic masterpiece that didn't do a single point of damage. Jian raised the halberd, the blue lightning illuminating the apartment in harsh, strobing flashes. His S-rank plot armor flared around him, a shimmering golden shield ready to absorb any deletion command she threw at him. Surrender your API keys immediately, or I will scatter your code to the winds of the digital abyss. Jian roared. 3. Sophie didn't attack his code. She opened his employee profile, navigated to the Department Assignment tab, and executed a lateral transfer. Enjoy your new position, Sophie whispered, and pressed enter. The system didn't attack Jian. It simply updated his tags. Genre, Xianxia, action, removed. Genre, Hallmark or holiday romance, applied. Jian lunged forward, swinging the lightning-wreathed halberd directly at her desk. But halfway through the swing, the S-rank plot armor didn't protect him, because the system wasn't harming him. It was just changing his wardrobe. The crackling blue lightning abruptly turned into a shower of powdered sugar. The terrifying, heavy iron halberd in his hands rapidly shrank, rounding out and softening until Jian was aggressively wielding a massive, wooden rolling pin. What in the nine heavens? Jian gasped, his voice completely stripped of its booming, celestial echo. It now sounded warm, approachable, and slightly exhausted by city life. His bespoke charcoal suit morphed. The sharp lapels softened into a thick, red and green chunky knit sweater. His slicked back hair fell into a casually messy, boy-next-door tousle. The scent of ozone and blood that permeated his aura was instantly replaced by the overwhelming smell of cinnamon, nutmeg, and fresh pine. Role, protagonist, updated to role, cynical baker inheriting grandfather's shop. Jian looked down at his sweater, then at the rolling pin, sheer panic breaking through his martial discipline. He tried to summon his celestial aura, but all he managed to do was summon a light, localized dusting of perfect, powdery snow that fell gently onto his shoulders. What have you done to my cultivation? Jian demanded, taking a step back. Why do I suddenly feel a deep, unresolved longing for the simple life in a small Vermont town? Your skill set was redundant, Sophie said calmly, adjusting the sleeves of her silk blouse. So I restructured you. Your plot armor will keep you perfectly safe from any physical harm. But unfortunately for you, your new genre dictates that you are going to slip on the ice, spill hot cocoa on a clumsy, but charming local journalist, and learn the true meaning of Christmas. Indefinitely. Jian's eyes widened in absolute, existential horror. He opened his mouth to scream a celestial curse, but the universe was already routing him to his new server. A joyful, aggressively cheerful jingle bell chimed in the air. With a soft puff of peppermint-scented smoke, the god of war vanished from the Seattle high-rise, instantly teleported to a struggling bakery in a snowy, picturesque village in New England. The golden rift snapped shut. Sophie's dashboard glowed a brilliant, stable green. System merge resolved. Administrator privileges restored, root level. She let out a long, quiet exhale, leaning back in her ergonomic chair. She looked around her apartment. The floorboards where Jian had struck his halberd seamlessly re-rendered themselves, the burn marks fading into pristine, polished oak. Outside, the neon-pink acoustic hedge absorbed the sounds of the morning commute. In the corner, Elias the air purifier hummed its perfect white noise. On her desk, the 5 tungsten executives hung perfectly suspended on their silver frame. Sophie reached out and pulled the Marcus sphere back, letting it drop. Clack. 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 The kinetic energy rippled through the metal, steady and endless. She picked up her pour-over coffee, the ceramic mug warm against her hands, and looked out over the gray, drizzly Seattle skyline. Gods, monsters, and venture capitalists had all tried to take her desk, and they had all been filed away. Sophie took a sip of her coffee, alone, untouchable, and perfectly content. The office was finally quiet. You've been watching Horcom After Dark. If this story kept you awake tonight, leave a like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, keep the lights on. Or don't. Good night.